Haunted supermarket. I work in a supermarket, early shift, and part of my job is changing the shelf labels, for the price changes each day. Just this Wednesday, I was putting new labels on a shelf of hand soap when, about 2 foot along the shelf from me, a bottle shot off and landed in the middle of the aisle. I looked along the aisle at my colleague and she just shrugs her shoulders and said, "This happens all the time." I've never directly witnessed anything else, but being one of the first on the shop floor each day, I'm now questioning all the items that I see sitting in the aisles first thing in the morning, and guessing I can't blame untidy customers for them all. My great-aunt lived way out in the middle of nowhere, by an old southern prison. This was before most people had TV, so she had been listening to the radio, and found out that a violent prisoner had escaped from the prison nearby. She walked into her bedroom and had one of those old saggy mattresses and felt something under the bed. She said something didn't feel right and she slowly got off the bed and called the police. When they arrived, they found the prisoner under her bed holding a knife from her kitchen. He told them he had been waiting for her to go to sleep so he could stab her to death. My cousin and his family, wife and infant son, had lived in their house for about 5 years. One morning his wife left home to drop the baby off at daycare before work, but realized she had left her phone at home. Entering the house, she turned the corner to the hallway, and nearly ran into the drop-down attic ladder which was fully extended. They never used the attic because it was filled with loose insulation, and my cousin had left for work hours earlier. She quietly left the house, drove around the corner and called the police. When the police arrived, they found a short-range transmitter connected to several cameras hidden throughout their home. The light fixture in the shower, the ceiling fan above their bed, even a pinhole in the nursery were sending videos to a nearby location. Their neighbor who lived a few houses away had been given a key by the prior owners, and installed surveillance equipment once he knew their schedule. My cousin's wife walked in on him updating his equipment, but he forgot something at his house and left to get it when she walked in. He had been watching them for years. The Boogeyman. I'm a journalist and was told this story by a woman I interviewed for a true crime article. When this woman was a young girl, about 8 years old, she started to come downstairs at night to tell her father that there was a man in her closet. He tells her there's no such thing as the Boogeyman, and sends her back to bed. This happens on and off for like a week. Finally, he gets frustrated and walks her back to the room and says, "I'll show you there's nothing in your closet," and goes to open the door. It opens an inch, and then he feels someone slam it shut. It turns out there really was a man in her closet. This guy would come into the house every night and stare at the girl from the closet while she slept. The dad attacked the man, and the man went to prison for many years. I researched her story 20 years after this happened. The guy had just gotten out of jail again and no one could find him. One night working late in the lab at school, I had to grab something from an upstairs classroom. It was after midnight and the entire building was empty and dark. Suddenly the phone in the classroom starts ringing. So after the shock, I decided to answer it. It was silent. Not even a dial tone. So I hop out and go back to my dorm. The next day I have class in that room, so I ask my professor how often people call the classroom phone by mistake. He looks at me funny, and says the phone in that room has been disconnected for years. Ghosts on a tin roof. I'm a nighttime tour guide at an old prison in Australia. It's run by the government, so the tours are pretty watered down and family friendly. The tours run between 6 and 9 on Wednesday and Friday nights. And some of the scariest things I've ever experienced have happened there. I'm not convinced in ghosts and whatnot, but if there are, they're definitely there. Every other person who works there has their own creepy story. My scariest was when I had a group of about 30 people in the gallows one night, the room where people were hanged, and the room is made of corrugated tin. So I was there doing my bit when suddenly there was this huge bang on the roof. Everyone looked up, and a few people screamed but a lot laughed. We have a few actors that jump out on tours, so they probably thought it was that. The banging didn't stop though. It was kind of irregular, at sort of like half-second intervals, like boom, 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 and people we getting creeped, me included. So I took the group outside. Now the roof of the room is a slanted A-frame, so if you walk back a bit you can see the outside roof. We all watched as this one bit of tin looked like it was being stomped on from the outside, moving and everything, still banging when I took the group to the next spot. We finished off the tour, and a few people thought it was a joke, but it genuinely terrified me. I came home pretty late one night, and my roommate's bedroom was shut, and I assumed she was sleeping already, but I saw something out of the corner of my eye in the kitchen. I said her name but she didn't answer. I didn't think anything of it, so I walked into my room, and before I turned the light on something whispered, "I'm still here." I turned on the light in my room, but nothing was there, so I turned on every light in my house, and knocked on my roommate's door, and I eventually opened it but she wasn't there. So I left her light on, and slept with all the lights on. When she came back the next morning, I asked her if she was messing with me, and she started crying and she said, "I left because something was in the house messing with me, and I had to get out." A few months ago, I had this really scary dream that seemed so real. In my dream, I was in my bed doing something on my laptop. Suddenly I just had a bad feeling, something wasn't right. Like I somehow knew something was in my room with me that shouldn't be there. I jumped off my bed, and hurry and flipped my light on. I flipped it on just in time to see this weird black shadow sphere thing, with legs zoom under my bed. I woke up scared and crying, but it felt so real, and I just knew whatever I saw was very evil. The next day, me and my dad were watching one of those ghost shows like My Ghost Story on TV. In the episode this woman was in her room, and all of a sudden she felt like something wasn't right. She turned her light switch on, just in time to see a weird black shadow sphere thing with legs scurry under her bed. It pretty much looked exactly like the thing I saw in my dream. I flipped out. A few months ago I downloaded a program for my phone. Sleep by Android. I bought the premium version of the app, for the extra features to record sound throughout the night, when volumes reached a certain threshold. It would activate when I would snore, or move around. I would usually spend the next evening going over some of the recorded sounds. Everything was pretty normal until I listened to something out of the ordinary. It was near the beginning of April, and I had the apartment to myself. It started out picking up my snoring, and then the hairs on my neck stood up, as I hear my doorknob moving. Following this, you can hear my door open slowly. I was confused and a little worried. Everything was still locked up, nobody came home, the chain lock was still latched on the front door, and my landlord certainly didn't come. I don't use the app anymore. My grandmother swore by this story till her dying day. It was during the war in London, and my dad was a baby. She was bombed out of her house and was staying with a friend. The friend had set her up in a room on the top floor. Anyway, she was taking my dad upstairs to bed, when a figure materialized on the stairs, telling her not to sleep in that room tonight. She quickly went back downstairs, and told her friend that she and my dad were sleeping in the sitting room that night. Her friend was annoyed but agreed. That night a bomb exploded near the house, and the roof caved in, right on top of my dad's cot. He would have been killed. I was backpacking in the Beartooth Wilderness in the early 2000s, with a good friend. After 3 days into the hike, we had only seen one other couple. On the third night at about 4 a.m., we were awoken in our tent, to what sounded like screams in the forest, big guttural screams. Obviously, we were freaked out sitting in the tent not knowing what was out there. We started hearing what sounded like hail for about 15 minutes, followed by heavy footsteps near our camp. My friend and I started yelling, and making tons of noise, and the commotion outside the tent slowly came to a halt. In the morning, after not sleeping at all, we unzipped the tent to the creepiest scene. All around the tent were literally thousands of little pebbles that were not there the evening before. Surrounding the tent in a near perfect circle, were 20 or so 150 to 300 pound boulders. My friend and I ran out of there, making a 3-day hike into one, practically running the entire weight of the car. I have 4 little cousins, who never got to meet my grandfather. He passed before they were born. One morning, they ran downstairs for breakfast as they usually do. As my uncle was getting their food ready, one pointed to the fridge and said, "That's him." My uncle, not thinking much of it, said, "Who?" and looked over. They were pointing at a picture of my grandfather, that they never got to meet. My cousin responded, "The man that comes and talks to us at night, until we fall asleep." A few months before my mother died, she and my sister were discussing strange happenings at our old home. My mother stated that she had seen a dark shape originate from the closet in her bedroom several times, and she proceeded to describe this being as appearing to be wearing a dark cowl, covering the upper torso. My sister was amazed by my mother's description of the shape that she had remembered as standing over her crib, and poking her with a bony finger. They called me and asked if I had had any sightings in the house, and I told them of the shadowy being that constantly stood at the foot of my bed, leaving me with a fear of the night, so strong that I would not go to sleep without my covers wrapped around my head, forming a blindfold for my eyes. But I can still remember sensing this thing, and knowing if I looked out from under my makeshift blindfold, that I would see it standing there. My brother also told us of the little man that would come out of the closet, just about every night, and stay in his room. His shadow figure was more viewable, even allowing my brother to describe that strange tam-like hat the being wore. All of us will admit to the fact that going up to our rooms, a sense of anxiety would start at the base of your feet, as you started up the steps, easing somewhat after you got to your room, and checked out for the dark ones. But, none of us would come down those steps alone, and turn our backs to the landing. We would back down those steps, believe it or not. It still makes my skin crawl when I talk about it. When I was younger, I had an imaginary friend who lived in this massive antique dresser. We'd chill out, and I vividly remember him telling me stories, although I have absolutely no recollection of what they actually were. I remember one day talking to my parents about it. Dad traveled quite a bit, so he wasn't up to date with what I was into, and when I started telling him about my dresser buddy, he wanted to know his name. It was something innocent like Peter or Patrick, but I can still see him going white in the face. I drew Peter/Patrick out for him, and the very next day, he and my uncle took out that dresser, and burned it. It wasn't until a few years later, when I found out my dad's little brother, my uncle, also had the same friend, with the same name who lived in the same antique dresser. After a few months of the typical imaginary friend, my uncle started having night terrors, and couldn't sleep because of Peter/Patrick. It got so bad that they had to move him out of his room, before he managed to get back to normal. This actually happened to a friend of mine. She used to live in an entirely different town when she was younger, and her closet had this strange door in the back of it. Whether it was imagined just due to her being a child at the time, or if it really did happen, she started to hear noises coming from behind this door whenever she went to bed. She told me that several times she tried telling her parents that she was hearing noises, but they never believed her. So some time goes by, and one day her parents get a call from the police, because they just arrested a homeless man. This was not just any homeless man though. This man was living in some sort of tunnel, that goes straight to that door in the back of her closet. So every once in a while, for whatever reason, this man would come through that door, and watch my friend sleep in her closet. About 30 years ago my mom went on a blind date. Her date took her to a restaurant, and although he was nice enough, she just wasn't into him. Not even halfway through the meal she was already thinking of ways to leave early. The waiter could tell. While my mom's date was in the restroom, the waiter approached her, and asked her if she was okay. She explained she was on a blind date, and not having much fun. Turns out the waiter was just about to get off work. He offered to give her a ride home if she waited another 10 minutes. She considered it, and was about to say yes, when her date came back from the restroom. She gave a subtle head shake no to the waiter and smiled. She and her date finished their meals, and he took her home. The next night my mom was watching the evening news. A story comes on about a woman being murdered behind a restaurant the night before. The restaurant was the one she had been at. They showed the murderer's picture. It was the waiter. Years ago, I stayed for some nights at a hotel in the New Forest, which is a national park, on the south coast of England. The hotel was a large former hunting lodge built sometime in the 19th century. I felt very uncomfortable in my room, and almost as though there were others there, or someone watching me. I am not the kind of person that is normally given to such feelings, but they were very strong, and extremely uncomfortable. I was with a large group staying there, and speaking to others after the first night. Many felt the same. That first night it took me a long time to fall asleep, and for the first time in my entire adult life, I could not bring myself to turn out the lights before I went to bed. When I eventually fell asleep, I had the most vivid dreams that felt extremely real of being in a trench somewhere during the Great War, and hearing the constant banging of explosions, and of artillery pieces firing. I woke up feeling extremely distressed, and with a cold sweat. There was a banging noise, which I assume must have been some metal roofing, not affixed properly, moving in the wind. I've never felt anything like it since, and had never felt anything like it before. It felt so very real, and I was completely overwhelmed with so many emotions, and utterly terrified. I couldn't get back to sleep. I felt like I was in the company of others. I felt like someone was near, or that feeling you get when you know people are looking at you. I spent the rest of the night in a kind of daze. In the morning I went downstairs for breakfast, and saw a frame on the wall containing some photographs, and a story about how the hotel was converted to a military hospital during World War I. I did not know anything about this before I arrived, and before that night. I had also not been reading anything about the war, or had seen anything on television recently about it. I'm a practical, and skeptical, but I don't know what to make of that experience. I spent the remainder of the stay with one of my friends, in another room. The oppressive atmosphere, and general feeling of something wrong, was frightening to me, and it did not go away, and my friend I stayed with, was also afraid, and was glad to have me stay with her in her room. So tell us what you think of the stories, and if you would like to see more like this in the future, and as always, please like and subscribe.